What is going on, guys? Skull Rider here. So somewhat recently I finished reading a book by C.S. Lewis called The Great Divorce. And boy, did this book sure have an impact on me. To put it crudely, it's like a thought experiment in the form of a novel with many extremely deep questions about life and, well, life after life presented in such an imaginative and yet powerful way. With that being said, there's definitely so much to unpack and think about from this narrative. And hey, I mean, what better way to do that than making a YouTube video? But yeah, before watching this video, I would still highly recommend reading this book if you are at all interested in topics such as good and evil, Christianity, and of course, the afterlife. But heck, even if you're not really into any of those, I guarantee you'll still get something from this book because Lewis has this way of writing that really just makes even the most in-depth topics both interesting and applicable. But anyway, enough rambling, and let's get right into this analysis of The Great Divorce, a consummation of joy. In 1945, C.S. Lewis published a novel on the conception of heaven and hell known as The Great Divorce. While the title has an element of finality and, well, also just sounds cool, it's also a nod to an earlier work written by author William Blake titled The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. To kind of simply sum up the major ideas of this work, Blake has the thought that at the end of all things, good could be interpreted as evil and evil likewise for good, and therefore both could be reconciled in the next world, given enough time and patience. Lewis, however, saw such a reconciliation as impossible. Lewis viewed the journey in this world as an expanding circle rather than a collapsing one. It's not that all the information and personality we acquire accumulates into one and is complete, but rather each different choice that's made in life are like paths going in opposite directions, expanding away from one another in parallel lines. The closer one draws towards perfection, which is on one side of the circle, the further they draw from the depravity on the other side. Thus, the title of Lewis's novel shows the power of opposites when compared to Blake's. For what room is there in a joyous and bright wedding ceremony for the lasting pain of divorce? But let's take another look at why, at the fundamental level, heaven and hell must be different and separate from each other. Now, if you want to be spared of me ranting about philosophy, skip to this timestamp in the video. If the joining of good and evil was the ultimate end goal, the choice between a virtue and a vice would be void. For example, if the first choice you must make leads you further away from the end goal, how can the accumulation of those choices go somewhere that did not have anything to do with the initial choice? What you decide to choose and how you decide to live would not matter because your destination would eventually be the same as everyone else's. And by whatever means you decide to obtain material goods such as money, therefore, would not matter in the slightest. Assuming there's no law enforcement to be afraid of, stealing is much, much easier and effortless than working for such things yourself. Also, the significance of choosing whether to do a right or wrong action would be of no importance if, well, you're going to go back to the start at the end anyway. One final note made from Lewis about the problems of such a conjoined afterlife would be that would not such a world merely just be Earth and life as we know now, where there is so much good yet so much evil? As we will soon see, the afterlife Lewis has in mind in The Great Divorce is much different than the existence we know now. Lewis describes hell as an empty, endless gray land, which isn't very surprising. However, this is a bit peculiar when you discover that all of the inhabitants of hell literally have the power to make whatever they desire manifest just by thinking about it. Because of this, you may think that maybe someone would have reformed the place or at least make it look more welcoming. Though it seems like none of this has happened because all these ghosts seem to have their own self-interest in this place and really only manifest more land when they want to move away from someone or are annoyed by them, thus only making this plain gray expanse larger. When first entering heaven and departing the bus, all the spirits from hell immediately become uncomfortable. They are not quite solid or in tune with the rest of the environment there, and in fact a majority of the ghosts immediately want to return to the lands of hell. One ghost, when talking to his friend who was a solid creature there, refused to even call the gray land hell, and never would have thought of it that way. Hell to one ghost is merely a reflection and reality of his beliefs and his opinions, almost like a validation of them. He does not care what they do to his state of solidity so long as he can be respected. This was similar to another ghost who was under the impression that his rights would not be respected in heaven. He was confused as to why some solid people could even be allowed there, since these people had done horrific things on earth such as murder. In one particular interaction with another ghost and solid person, the solid person announces that when him and the others first arrived in heaven, they were, quote, a bit ghostly. However, for this former ghost to become solid, it didn't really seem to take much effort, and wore off almost in an automatic way. The ghosts of hell, however, refused to let the process begin for any sort of reasons, and for this ghost in particular, it was because of a fixation and inability to look past herself. It's not that the ghosts are somehow failing to complete certain tasks to start the process, rather they are sabotaging their own automatic development. With this in mind, Lewis presents hell as some sort of stagnant, an unchanging cycle, while heaven is an unending progression of goodness. The ghosts simply can hardly handle being there since, because they haven't even started this eternal process, it's almost like having the boss fight of a video game at the very first level. This process of changing, however, is shown to us by no means to be an easy one. It involves a kind of death and surrender of the pasts of the ghosts. There is a ghost with a lizard companion on its shoulder, and the ghost seems to be very embarrassed and annoyed at the presence of this lizard, despite it giving some temporal pleasure in hell. However, the man runs into an angel who tells the man that he can rid him of the lizard if he just gets his permission. The ghost is hesitant at first, saying that he would rather compromise and just shut the lizard up for a bit. But the angel states that that would not be possible and asks the man again if he can kill the lizard. The man finally submits and in much pain watches the lizard die. But upon this, the ghost immediately begins to turn solid and the lizard turns into a majestic stallion. The now solid ghost puts his hand on the horse, then rides off with his new companion into the distance. It is then explained that the man could not continue on with the lizard into the mountains because it was simply too weak. A tiny lizard could by no means traverse the same amount of distance as a grand stallion. While Lewis doesn't state this directly, I'm under the impression that the lizard was a representation of some sort of sensual sin such as lust, while the stallion could be a great energy of desire that arises out of lust's killing. This is a powerful demonstration of how out of the death of a vice comes the rise of an even greater virtue. Before witnessing this, however, the protagonist becomes in doubt of the legitimacy of heaven, and if the ghosts can really be turned into solid people, or if the bus ride is all just a ruse for the solid people seeing the pain and awkwardness of the ghosts. But before being completely consumed by these thoughts, the protagonist happens to run into the spirit of the renowned Christian writer George MacDonald. MacDonald gives some crucial advice to understanding the dynamics of these two realms. First off, we find out that the area the protagonist is in some way a purgatory of heaven, which this description could give rise to some problems given the words of Christ in Luke 16:26. However, it's important to note that this whole scenario is hypothetical, and Lewis's purpose is not to claim that this is exactly how heaven and hell are, rather simply to refute the idea that heaven and hell share the same elements. At the same time, we find out through the spirit of MacDonald that Lewis is under the impression that heaven and hell and the choices that people make to influence their ultimate destination start not at death, but during life. The spirit of MacDonald states that as you proceed further through heaven, the more agonies of the past will turn to glory. On the contrary, the further you proceed through hell, the more temporal pleasures will turn into agony. MacDonald says that in the end, the damned will say, "We have never been anywhere except hell," and the saved, "We have never been anywhere except heaven." Lewis plays with the idea of eternity and just giving us a sense of how immeasurably vast it would be. Well, yes, many people have extremely hard, challenging, and horrendous things happen to them in this life. Lewis is prone to the idea that, given the vastness of eternity, all of those things will either be swallowed up and forgotten, or the pain will be turned to glory by the greater good behind it being revealed. But it is more than just the passing of, well, endless time needed for a ghost to become solid. It's also the choice of giving up. The surrendering, as you may say, of some kind of selfishness. Now, I'm not going to sit in this video and talk about whether repentance being needed goes against the idea of salvation of saved through faith alone. That's a whole nother can of worms, but I will say that the making of such choices seem to influence this idea of heaven and hell as progressions that Lewis has brought up. I think it can at least be made clear that all individuals are on some kind of path, and a choice, whether it be their own or influenced by the like of the Holy Spirit, makes them turn around. Now this brings up another interesting question as to whether someone on track to heaven can turn around and start progressing in the other direction, getting into the idea of once saved, always saved, but that again is certainly another question for another video. MacDonald also reveals that all of the ghosts in hell have freely chosen to be there. MacDonald states this: there are only two kinds of people in the end, those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says in the end, "Thy will be done." All that find their residence in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires a non-temporal joy will ever miss it. Those who seek find. To those who knock, it is opened. Hell is simply a rejection of the lasting joy over cheap temporal ones that must constantly be replaced like a drug. There is therefore also a lack of freedom in this. The ghosts, as mentioned before, are still not entirely aware of the state that they are in as well. They have made their own realities through cheap fulfillment of their desires. Upon entering heaven, which is depicted as the true reality, they are not quite sure what's going on and want to go back to the environment they are used to, regardless if it is ultimately detrimental to them. Actually, now that I think about it, this depiction of true reality and joy and becoming solid is extremely similar to Plato's allegory of the cave, and I would not be surprised if Lewis took some inspiration from its picture. Even the ghost of an artist who desires to paint heaven is told by a solid person that it's pointless because, well, there's no point in depicting something through a second medium that you and everyone else experiences constantly. However, this gets us into an extremely interesting debate as to what true selflessness is regarding the solid people in heaven. Now, MacDonald states that the solid people can choose to go back and help any ghosts that happen to be wandering in this area of heaven, but it requires them giving up the freedom of progressing further into the mountains. However, the solid people cannot go to hell itself to rescue these people, as for example with the ghost of Sarah, who we'll talk about later in this video, states that the joy cannot be shaken, the light can swallow up the darkness of the ghost, but unlike earth, the darkness of the ghost can no longer affect the light. The joy of heaven can only be brought to those suffering, not the other way around. This is much like the idea of how Jesus could touch lepers or other unclean people without himself becoming unclean. Hell can no longer be brought into these purified people. In fact, hell really only seems to be in existence because the wills of those in there are allowing it to. But let's return back to the process of journeying through the mountains. Some people may see this as a problem because, well, if these solid people are journeying just to experience a deeper and more fulfilling version of the ultimate joy, how is that different than the people progressing through hell, also journeying further for their own sake? One could also tie this to the idea of nirvana in Buddhism, but unlike this view, the journey likely has some other purpose other than some kind of freeing of the self or escapism in a way. So if this journey entails showing love to other people and also God himself throughout its course, how could it be selfish? Therefore, depending on the purpose of the journey, it seems like either choice, to stay behind or to progress through the mountains, is an act of selflessness on the part of the solid person. As stated earlier, the ghosts are also consumed by their behaviors. Negative behavior, even in the slightest, can be turned into a consumption. If this behavior is left unchecked and ignored, just a little grumble could eventually turn a person into an uncontrolled machine of grumbling. Lewis notes that all goodness and energy radiating from the solid people comes directly from God, and this is most clearly seen with the spirit of Sarah Smith. MacDonald states there is even joy enough in the little finger of Sarah to waken all of the dead things of the universe into life. So the spirits of heaven quite literally share and are cohorts of the power and love held by the living God himself. This could likely be Lewis displaying a tangible depiction of the process talked about by Paul in 1 Corinthians 6:17. Now, the ghost that Sarah talks to doesn't seem to understand how she could feel so fulfilled without him. But what he fails to understand, however, is that his ultimate joy doesn't need to be dependent on her. Only God. As crazy as this sounds, this logically and philosophically makes sense. If you have the entire essence of love and joy inside of you, assuming that's what God is, why would you need anything else to ever feel satisfied? If the dwarf ghost truly loves Sarah, he should be glad about this amazing and beautiful joy she's found. The tragedy of the damned can also be seen through the dwarf ghost that Sarah talks to, as he directly denies such warm, affectionate joy and his true self, which would be found in that joy, for some cheap, unsatisfactory version of himself. And finally comes the last big question that Lewis attempts to answer in this novel. Shouldn't everyone be saved? For there to be true victory and joy in heaven, shouldn't hell be empty? The problem with achieving such a victory is that those in hell, as Lewis writes, want to consent to be happy on their own terms. No one else shall taste joy, that theirs should be the final power. Along with this also comes a question of God's own justice, as would God not be unjust in just coercing everyone to heaven? At the end of the book, we actually find out that hell is merely a small crack in the ground, less than that of a pebble. MacDonald says this, and yet all loneliness, angers, hatreds, envies, and itchings that it contains, if rolled into one single experience and put into the scale against the least moment of the joy that is felt by the least in heaven, would have no weight that could be registered at all. Bad cannot succeed in being bad as truly as good is good. If all hell's miseries together entered the consciousness of yon wee yellow bird on the bough there would be swallowed up without a trace, as if one drop of ink had been dropped into the great ocean, which your terrestrial Pacific itself is only a molecule. Lewis's novel is not only an interesting thought experiment of the afterlife, but more so a depiction of the overwhelming victory of good against evil, and a hopeful promise that one day all pain, sorrow, evil, and hardship will be no more, all completely swallowed up and forgotten when presented with the beauty of a perfect reality. Well guys, that about does it for my analysis of this novel. If you made it this far, thanks so much for listening, and be sure to look forward to more content like this. I'm thinking of making my next video more of a laid back and entertaining one, since this one took me quite a lot of time and effort to make, and I don't want to keep you guys waiting for too long. But yeah, that about does it. Thank you all again so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. This is Skull Rider, signing out.